Welcome back, everybody, to session 2 of Future Trials 25. We begin this second session with a vital perspective from both patient and researcher. We're going to be welcoming shortly our special guest, Siobhan Gaynor. We heard from Siobhan earlier in our opening video. Siobhan was diagnosed with primary breast cancer in May 2019, and then in October 2020, she was diagnosed with metastatic breast cancer. Having also worked in the clinical research arena for a number of years, she decided to focus her time on working with researchers and clinicians to bring some much needed attention to Irish advanced cancer patients. She rejoined Cancer Trials Ireland as a member of their patient consultative committee and also sits on the National Clinical Trials Oversight Committee. And in this section, we'll also hear from her along with the chair, Professor Donal Brennan. Siobhan was awarded the Irish Cancer Society PPI Project of the Year in 2025 and recently received the Lifetime Achievement Award for an outstanding contribution to Irish healthcare. As you saw from Siobhan's video, she brings a unique and deeply valuable perspective to today's discussions. With many years of experience as a scientific and clinical researcher, she now applies that insight to her work in patient advocacy, bridging the worlds of science and lived experience with empathy and expertise by working with other Irish advanced cancer patients alongside researchers, clinicians and policymakers. Please join me in giving the warmest of welcomes to Siobhan.
Thank you, and thanks very much to the conference organisers, in particular Professor Fidelma Dunn, for the invitation to speak here today. So, as you heard from the introduction, for context, 1 year I was a primary breast cancer patient. As most women in the room will realise, that's 1 in 8 people, not uncommon, unfortunately. Then the following year, unfortunately, I was diagnosed metastatic. The cancer had appeared through various bones in my body. And what I felt very strongly about was that the experience as a patient between the two was very different and therefore very unsettling for me. So I decided to look into it in a bit. So what I'm going to be speaking to are statistics, evidence, and suggested future directions. So for context, remember that cancer is still the biggest killer in Ireland. In fact, we still have a situation where 2.5 times more people die every year in Ireland from cancer than did from COVID at its peak. So it still requires attention, it still requires focus, and we still have a huge mortality rate. Ireland, for all the money we spend on cancer, both in research and in treatment, we still have a large mortality in Ireland. Mortality being you die from the disease. We still have, and this is globally also, a very high incidence of cancer. That incidence is rising. The latest figures from our National Cancer Registry suggest that every year there's 3% more patients being diagnosed in Ireland. So cancer is not done. Cancer is not going away. There are more and more of us living with cancer due to advances in treatments, thanks to research performed by many of you in this room and globally. So we are a different group of patients in 2025. We're living longer. There's more treatment options available to us. But stage 4 or advanced cancer, or cancer that has progressed beyond the primary organ, is still, for the vast majority, incurable. That's the situation we're in. So, for example, in the case of breast cancer, 30% of primary breast cancer patients will go on at some point to recur or become metastatic, 30%. Now that can happen 20, 30, 40 years after the initial primary diagnosis. But metastases or recurrences of cancers are still not captured in our national cancer registries. So we have no accurate number in Ireland, or indeed many other countries, as to how many metastatic cancer patients there are. That's also because historically, the registries have focused on capturing the initial presentation with cancer and then following up after the patient has died and actually being discharged in terms of, people looking at your numbers at 5 years. But cancer has changed. And cancer at 5 years after the original primary diagnosis is very different in 2025 to what it was when the registry was set up. So basically, we feel as advanced cancer patients that we are not counted, that we don't know how many of us there are. And therefore, if you don't have the numbers, anyone involved in policy will tell you that we can't set up services if we don't even know how many patients we're talking about. So what I did was, when I was first diagnosed, I heard, because of my background in research, I had a lot of access to key opinion leaders, people who'd pick up the phone to me and go for coffee with me. And I was explaining my perspective as a patient, which is very different than when you're a researcher, no matter how good a researcher you are. And when I was explaining my perspective, I was being hit with a wall of lots of assumptions from medical oncologists and in general, doctors in general, about what we looked like, what we thought we wanted. And I felt the only way to bridge that gap was to actually ask patients what they felt was important. So I set up via Cancer Trials Ireland, very bravely, they allowed the first ever patient-led survey to be conducted by them, with me as the lead and Professor Seamus O'Reilly as the co-lead. And that was a very brave move. We've heard about PPI for years, and we've heard about patients being involved, but to actually allow a patient to lead and be the lead author on a project is something that has not happened to date in Ireland. So that was a very brave move, and we asked patients what matters to them. And what they told us is that what matters to them is they want access to their own patient notes. We still can't get access to our own patient records. They want access to palliative care. And that was actually one of the original ideas for the survey. When I started speaking to doctors, why aren't we referred to palliative care earlier in our disease course, soon after diagnosis? And the answer always was, oh no, we'd scare you. You think we've given up on you. But actually, palliative care is not just about end-of-life treatment. Palliative care is also about symptom control. And I got great value and great help and great support from palliative care, and I wanted other patients to experience that. But the barrier, the doctors told me, was if we ask you about palliative care, you'll think we've given up on you and hope will be gone. But I knew from talking to patients that that was not the case. And of course, that was borne out in the survey. Patients with metastatic breast cancer in Ireland want early access to palliative care. We want access to psycho-oncology. We want help with our mental health, because cancer is not just a physical disease, it's also a mental disease. There's lots of data for everything I'm saying. We want access to our own medical records. When you start looking, we heard earlier about guideline development in hypertension, but when you start looking as a patient for the guidelines guiding your own care for your own disease, and you realise in Ireland, there are none. There's no guidelines, clinical guidelines for the care of advanced cancer patients. And that's very worrying when you're not seeing yourself being mentioned. The current National Cancer Strategy, which is really good, by the way, and is really well thought out, no mention of stage 4 cancer patients. Now, when you start digging into that and wondering why is that, a lot of this is cultural. Frankly, we're incurable. So really, the system focuses on hope. You realize very quickly the system focuses on cure, but where there is no cure, unfortunately, the lens isn't shone on you and you feel a bit neglected. But the reality is that advanced cancer today and advanced cancer patients today, we're younger, we're living longer. Many of us are still working. Many of us are still caring for children, caring for parents, carrying the burden of all of the normal responsibilities of life and living with our stage 4 cancer. We are living longer and longer, but we do not have a focus on our care at the moment. And we really feel that, for example, when you're designing research programs, why aren't you including patients with advanced or metastatic disease? I know there's good regulatory reasons, etc., and sometimes commercial reasons, but unless you study a phenomena, you're never going to figure out what works. So we feel as a group of patients with advanced cancer that unfortunately there's limited awareness of what stage 4 looks like. And by the way, I'm not unique. You see me and people always say to me, oh my God, you look so well. Transfer 40 other patients with metastatic breast cancer into this room, we'd all look well. Now, we've all got stuff going on, there's no doubt about that. And in many cases, our disabilities are hidden. But at the same time, we are able to stand up, we are able to talk at conferences, we are able to participate in our own care, and we just want more focus on our treatment. And unless you shine a light on the metastatic setting, you will never change mortality. So at the moment, in the case of cancer generally, 90% of cancer deaths are in the metastatic setting. So you die predominantly from metastatic disease, not primary disease. But yet, there's very little known about the metastatic cancer patient. Why aren't we studied? Why aren't we understood? Why aren't our needs listened to? So our call to action is um, we want to partner with clinicians. We want to partner with policymakers as patients to figure out how to move this forward and how to change the situation. And I say partnership deliberately because I've been listening here today to you all talking about patient-centric approaches, patients being at the heart of it. But unless we're actually included in the room in which these discussions are happening, unless we're actually consulted, we're not really your partners. Will remain guinea pigs. So I would ask you and urge all of you here today to consider partnering with patients from very early stages and asking us what our needs are. Because without asking us what's important to us, how can you know where to focus? How can you know what our unmet needs are? Yes, there's many unmet physical and medical needs, but actually what's the unmet need of the patients? So we need more data, we need more treatments, we need more focus on what our needs, the holistic needs of patients, not just the tumor needs. And finally, we've come up with, as a group of advanced cancer patients, a very specific set of data streams and deliverables that we feel will help. And we've started to work, for example, with the All Ireland Cancer Research Group, looking at how do we count the numbers of patients with advanced disease. We're starting to speak to groups like the Irish Society for Medical Oncology, who want to partner with us and work with us on developing not just guidelines, but checklists as well, because as we've heard earlier, guidelines take a long time to develop. And we want to partner with other relevant groups in policy. And most importantly, we want to ensure that the next cancer strategy, which will start in 2027, so debates are starting at the moment about what that will look like. What we want very firmly as a group of patients is a focus in the next national cancer strategy on our needs, along with the resources and infrastructure that would be required to deliver that fairly and equitably. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Siobhan. Thank you. A powerful message and a call to action for all of us to work together towards a fit for purpose research environment, supporting all patient journeys and embracing that real patient-led research to ensure that Ireland's clinical research system reflects the full spectrum of all patients' needs. Next, we hear from Professor Tom Melvin on the EU's work to develop a harmonised approach to early feasibility studies. Early feasibility studies are an essential early stage clinical trials for medical devices, helping developers to focus on innovations that address serious or unmet medical needs. Please welcome Professor Tom Melvin, who will give us an overview of developments at a European level. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you today. Tom Melvin is my name, and I joined the Institute for Clinical Trials earlier this year, and it's been a real pleasure to see truly how operational and scientific excellence drive the mission there to translate research into impact. What I'd like to talk to you about today is a European project where we're looking to support early stage clinical studies of novel medical devices. So we'll present some preliminary findings on how that study has been going. Firstly, to explain some of the challenges when you're trying to get early stage clinical research of a novel medical device. This ecosystem has become more challenging across Europe in recent years. Developers report increased research and development costs to do all of the bench and preclinical testing that you need to do. We have a revised and increasingly complex regulatory ecosystem where trying to understand the kinds of technical documentation and the type of preparatory work to get your study approved and then implemented can be more challenging. And we see, especially for early stage studies that are multi-state, you often have to apply to each national authority individually. They can have different approaches and procedures, and this can complicate your preparations to get your regulatory approvals. The result of this is that there can be uncertainty for innovators, and this is vital because you have to be able to attract funding and you have to have clear market pathways in order to do that. It is sometimes claimed that this confluence of challenges challenge the competitiveness of the overall European system. So we may see products introduced in other territories first, or products disseminated elsewhere. And for patients, this means that their opportunity to decide if I want to engage in a study of a novel medical device can be limited, because sponsors may be going to other places to run their trial and introduce their products. When we think of any medical device technology, they all have to pass through generic life cycle stages, moving from concept to prototype, through your bench testing and preclinical work to get ready for your first clinical study. In order to do that as a new product developer, you have to have a series of strategies. You have to have a clinical, a regulatory, and a technical strategy, and they have to be sufficiently robust in order to attract funding, because all of these studies cost money and you have to have a clear funding plan, regardless of whether you're looking at public funding or private funding sources. When we think of there's an error message on the screen. It says Microsoft PowerPoint is not responding. Hopefully we can fix that. I could go on without the slides, and we could maybe try and fix it in the background. Oh, there we go. So, when we think about the clinical development of a novel medical device, it looks very different for medicines as compared to devices. Here you can see the pathway for a new medicine to go through its phases of clinical trials in order to get a market authorization at phase 3. We don't tend to have debates about the fundamentals of clinical study design. You have to have your phase 1 study for basic safety, phase 2 for dose finding, phase 3 to demonstrate safety and efficacy to get your market authorization and enter the market. Medical devices are very different, and there's a number of reasons for that. We have a different evidence standard. For a medical device, you have to show clinical data providing sufficient clinical evidence, but what is sufficient is not defined, and we don't have guidance to help developers to understand that. Many low-risk medical devices can come to market without any clinical study. So if we think of simple surgical instruments and things like that, they can often be assessed thoroughly through bench testing, animal testing, and in silico models using computers. You can also claim equivalence. So you could say, my device is the same as another device, and that can reduce your need to run a pre-market clinical study. But that's become somewhat more complicated with the new medical device regulation. And also medical devices often change. Based on your initial clinical experience, you might find that you want to change some aspect of the design of the device, and that's very different compared to the medicines framework, where you're right back to phase 1 again. So these things complicate how clinical development happens, and we need to try and find better ways to support and make this clearer for developers so that their clinical and regulatory strategy can be made more robust. The project that I'm going to talk about concerns early feasibility studies. So these are essentially limited clinical investigations. We're often talking about sample sizes of 5 to 15 patients, and it's done early in the development life cycle of a medical device. You'll see a difference with medical devices is you often will learn from your initial clinical experience the kind of refinements that you need to introduce. So with the discussion earlier on renal denervation, Prof. Sharif was talking about how the types of energy that is used for that catheter may change as you gather initial experience. And this is extremely commonplace with medical device development. We don't have phases for medical device studies, but we have a taxonomy. So this is in the box you can see here on the left. This came out in a guidance called ISO 14155, which concerns the good clinical practice of clinical studies. And this was only published in 2020, so it's only yet finding percolation into regulatory practice and how sponsors describe studies. But it's a good start, and we're starting to standardize the way we describe studies. In the United States, in 2013, they introduced the Early Feasibility Study Program. This was in an era when the US FDA were increasingly recognizing that it was difficult to run early stage studies of medical devices in the United States. And one of the effects of that was that the US FDA noted that there was an increasing time lag of beneficial technologies becoming available to US patients. The transcutaneous aortic valve devices, which are quite commonplace today, in the United States, they were the 42nd country in the world to improve these devices. and this really changed this internal strategy at FDA. So they made a decision within the agency. They didn't have to change their federal laws, they often have to do for new programs, and they decided to give more intensive advice and to help developers to set up these early stage studies. And it's proved to be a very popular program. You can see the figure here on the left. They've had over 400 studies now pass through this early feasibility program. In Europe, things are a little bit more complicated because we have a decentralized system. So we have 27 member states in the European Union, a couple of other countries under trade arrangements, and these are all the countries, if you're running a multi-state study, where you have to apply and get your approval. So to support early feasibility studies on a European basis, the Innovative Health Initiative funded the Harmonized EU Early Feasibility Programme. You can see here all of the different organizations that are involved. It brings academia, hospitals and healthcare providers, health technology bodies, patient groups, clinical research organizations who implement studies, as well as small and large medtech organizations. And what we'll present now are some of the preliminary results that I've been working on in that project. One of my jobs in the project was to try and find out what is the professional and organizational capacity of authorities around Europe. This has never been thoroughly explored or published previously. We also don't know the number of trials happening in Europe every year. So we did a survey and we managed to get 19 authorities to respond. What you can see here in the bar chart are 1,300 applications to authorities that were made throughout all of 2023. This doesn't relate to unique studies. So if you had a multi-state study, the numbers will be counted because it's based only on applications. But it gives us a nice impression of the volume and extent of clinical investigation work that happens in the European system. And the color here denotes the different risk classes. So the lilac color is lower risk devices, the orange color is higher risk devices. And what we see around the system is that there can be different extents of either low risk or high risk studies. We see some countries have over 300 applications per year. Some other member states in Europe only have a handful, or maybe one study a year. So trying to bring harmonization has to acknowledge these different dynamics and different ways of working in Europe. For early feasibility studies in particular, we only got results from 46 unique studies. But you can see the breakdown in the pie chart. What was interesting, I think, is that we had more early feasibility studies for lower risk devices than we had for higher risk devices. And 15% of early feasibility studies were for digital health, which is something I'm sure will grow in the future. We also looked at who are the assessors within competent authorities all around Europe. And again, this is based on 19 countries. We were able to find about 150 assessors, and you can see their professional breakdown here on the right-hand side of the screen. We had a large amount of people with clinical professional backgrounds. I think what was interesting is that we had quite a small number of technical expertise. So engineers came in at only 5%. And then there's a variety of other professions within authorities who can all assess medical device clinical studies. In the pie chart on the left, you'll see how often national authorities engage with external experts. So one country always does, but in other countries it's far less common. But this is really important to make sure that authorities are supported with expert perspectives when we have novel and advanced medical technologies. Something that I routinely hear when I talk to novel product developers is that having access to early advice to clarify your protocol and your preclinical development is absolutely vital. That helps with preparations, it helps to strengthen funding pitches, and it helps to streamline the assessment for authorities. What we found is that advice across Europe happens at quite different stages. So you can see here the different time points, either before you apply, during the assessment, or after the approval. And authorities are quite differently organized currently in the European system. Another thing we found out is that the type of advice you get is quite different to the US FDA, where you can go and have a pre-submission meeting, agree on a protocol design, and then go and fund and implement it. We haven't got that granularity of advice in our system yet in Europe. So this is a really important thing that we have to work on. A positive finding from the survey was that of all of the authorities surveyed, those who provided a response, it was unanimously positive that they saw the benefit in talking with developers. They noted that it strengthens the quality of the submissions, and that helps both the authority assessing the trial as well as the developer preparing it. So just to introduce some of the next steps in that project, it will run until 2027. Right now in the project, we're building really practical things, things to support your insurance contract, so your master clinical trial agreement between the developer and the research site. these are all things that are really important, especially to new product developers, where they're often encountering these things for the first time. Once we have these developed, we'll pilot them in real clinical studies that will be happening in collaboration with the large and small medtech companies in the project. And we'll then use that real experience to refine the recommendations and bring them to regulators. This is going to take some years. What I'd suggest is that in Ireland, we should act sooner. We have really good initiatives, and I'm looking forward to the sessions that are coming up. We have the talent, we have the capacity, and we have the expertise. So I think we can go a lot faster in Ireland to support these early stage clinical studies of novel medical devices. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Melvin. Thank you. In July 2024, the Minister for Health established the National Clinical Trials Oversight Group to strengthen Ireland's clinical research landscape. This group aims to increase the number of clinical trials, to increase participant access, and to support a nationally coordinated approach. And we've heard a lot about the need for that coordination today. The goal of the group is to enhance Ireland's reputation as a clinical trials hub and ultimately improve patient outcomes through a more efficient, attractive and effective trial environment. We're now delighted to welcome Professor Donal Brennan, who's the chair of the National Clinical Trials Oversight Group, to give us an update on the very important work of this group so far. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks very much. These are my disclosures. So you've just heard really what the role of the Clinical Trials Oversight Group is, and I guess this is taken from our terms of reference, but really it is about improving the ecosystem for clinical trial activity across the country. And I guess whilst we have been very much focused on investigation medical products and I suppose the clinical trial regulation from the point of view EU, we do expect, particularly when I come to Galway, that this will have an impact on medtech as well. And your local representative, Professor Dunn, has been a huge advocate of the fact that we need to address all clinical trials, not just standard medical interventions. I'm not going to go through our objectives in great detail, but they are really about bringing together as many stakeholders as possible to try and develop a better plan for clinical trials across the country. And that includes pharma, it includes CROs, it includes academia, but also, and probably most importantly, it includes different departments from within the government, because ultimately, if this is to work, it has to become very much a government policy that we really want to push clinical trials, clinical trial infrastructure and clinical research as a whole across the country. And we do probably need to develop a unique selling point for Ireland so that we do actually attract international investment in this area. So what have we done? Well, we've had 11 meetings now, actually. That's incorrect. This talk was prepared for another meeting. We've had a number of subgroups focused on specific areas around contracts, costings, workforce planning, and also financial incentives to improve, I suppose, Ireland as a nation, particularly around, I suppose, tax R&D credits, which are under review at the moment with the Department of Finance. We prepared interim recommendations, which were presented to the last cabinet meeting of the last government, and we're now currently preparing our final recommendations. And what I'm really going to talk to today is the interim recommendations and the progress that's been made on those recommendations. And I think it was very important that we have tried to be lean and nimble, and we have managed to interact very closely with government through our secretariat within the Department of Health, led by John O'Neill, who you're going to hear from later. But our work was included in the programme for government. As you can see, it's very clearly stated that it is a priority for the government to actually increase the number of patients going on clinical trials. And obviously this will also fit in with the idea that there will be a life sciences strategy. I think one thing that we have to be careful of is that whilst we all wait for a life sciences strategy, that this work needs to be done in the meantime. And it may seem daunting, but I would argue that a lot of the building blocks are in place to really promote Ireland as a top-class destination for clinical trial activity. And it's really about coordination, teamwork, and working together to try and develop, to bring all those pieces together. This is a nice piece of work done by IQVIA, looking at, I suppose, not only the population, but the preparedness of a country to actually perform a clinical trial. And what you can see clearly is that whilst we will never compete with the large countries like the United Kingdom, Spain in particular, which has obviously made huge strides over the last 10 years, Germany and France. But we can definitely work in the second tier and be very clearly towards the top of that tier and compete with countries of similar size. We hear a lot about Denmark, and Denmark is obviously an excellent example, but of course Denmark is a bit of a unicorn as well, with the fact that AstraZeneca has been so successful. But places like Belgium and the Netherlands are just as successful in many ways and maybe better options in the long term to compare to. So these were our interim recommendations, and they really concentrated around contracts, data protection and costings. And I guess, as all of you who do clinical trials will know, that the contract issues have been a major problem for the last number of years. But I do see significant improvements even before our group came into existence. And I suppose timing is everything in life, and we've been able to ride that wave to some degree and improve the contracts. I'm just going to talk through the different, I suppose, progress that's been made over the last 6 months since these interim recommendations were submitted to government. We're going to talk a little bit about contracts. Really, what we really wanted was a pre-agreed model CTA, which would actually allow us to avoid repetitive independent legal review, so that when you get your regulatory approval, that you can get your contract signed almost simultaneously and get your first patient on study. And we did advise KPIs. We suggested that there would be an 80% uptake of a mandated or agreed pre-model contract, and that there will be a 42-day KPI from regulatory approval to contract sign-off. Personally, I think we need to change that, and we probably will change that in our final recommendation. I would expect that we would be looking at a 60-day KPI to first patient on study. Really, it doesn't matter when you sign the contract. It's when you get your first patient on study that's really going to prove to people that that's how we are a really lean, efficient, clinical trial focused nation. Since that piece of work was published, I have to acknowledge the work that Rachel Batten and Anna Terres did in the HSE to renegotiate those the model contract that was published last year. And now we have a new version of what was called initially the EFA HSE contract. And we really want to move away from that. We consider this as a bipartite contract and a tripartite contract, which is a model contract which we've hopefully made even easier to implement. And we did identify very significant issues around how we might speed up that process. The model CTAs have been renegotiated and will be published in the next few weeks. We are hoping that, given the fragmented nature of the Irish Health Service, that we can try to work towards single sign-offs. And this is a major issue. And sometimes it can be quite difficult to explain to prospective sponsors that you have HSE hospitals, you've voluntary hospitals, and then you've all this huge piece in the middle, which is the community, which come under different governance as well. However, the Voluntary Hospital Association have very clearly identified the fact that they do want to support research going forward, and they have agreed to undertake a single legal review of the new model contract, which will hopefully therefore mean that if an unedited contract is submitted, that it will not require future legal review and speed up that process. There's obviously a need to develop ongoing work around single sign-off, particularly at regional level, and electronic sign-off. One would hope that the development of regional research offices will support that work, but there is definitely anecdotal evidence, even in my own field within cancer, that we are getting faster, and that's coming not only from internal data, but also when we go to international meetings. There's definitely a feeling that Ireland is open for business, and that's what we want. The other issue that has come up, and you're all kind of aware of this, is data protection. And you see I've said data protection there, not GDPR, because GDPR is one part of data protection, but every meeting I go to, I get told that GDPR is a problem. The problem isn't GDPR, the problem is data protection, and I would actually argue the problem is the language we use around that. And what we asked in our interim recommendations were that there would be national guidance around roles and responsibilities, and also a national clinical trials dashboard, which would allow us to interact between sites, but also with patients. And I'm sure you've all seen the work that's come out of the UK over the last 2 days, where there's been massive investment in a national portal to link patients to clinical trials through NHS England. We really need to get onto this and within our own country too, because really patients want this, but also it's the way that we can really provide access to studies in an important fashion. We've worked exceptionally closely with the Data Protection Commission, and what we felt was, after multiple meetings, and many of the members of the National NCTOG are here today, it was very clear that a lot of the perceived problems were based on myths and misinterpretation of language. And what we've come up with is a very clear set of guidelines which have been endorsed by the Data Protection Commission around the use of DPIAs, around how we interpret the issue of implicit consent with regards to health research regulation, and also some of the issues around patient withdrawal from study. And these are all going to be published in the next few weeks on our website, which will, I think, give a lot of clarity to a lot of people. I'm not going to go through these in huge detail. They'll be available, and I'm happy that these slides will be available to people. But really, this is very clearly now stating that the sponsor is the data, when the sponsor is the data controller and the trial site is the data processor, that there's no need for a local DPIA assessment, and particularly once the National Research Ethics Committee have actually assessed a statement of compliance with GDPR. Things can get slightly more difficult when you have a joint setup where the sponsor and the local site are joint controllers, but of course that can be managed through a data management agreement. And again, repetitive assessment of local DPAs at local level should be very rarely required. One would never say never, because there are obviously situations that may be the case, but the suggestion that the studies should be held up because of repetitive local DPIA assessments should not be assessed. We've also had a clear, very good discussion around the role of the health research regulation and its impact, particularly on the CTR. And I'm not going to go through this in great detail, but very clearly the guidance is that if a patient, what is required to require explicit consent for data processing under the health research regulation, this can be offset under GDPR based on for other reasons. And again, this can often be considered a problem with regards to onward use of data, but we expect that this can be worked through with some education, and we have worked with the HRDPN to try and work on this going forward. As a country, we need to become more research tolerant and research, I suppose, friendly, and less worried about potential legal issues that will arise around clinical trials, because ultimately clinical trial activity is a low risk issue. I'm not going, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the issues around withdrawal of consent, but these are very clearly assessed and these data will be available. I'm going to finish up on costings. There's a perception out there, whether it's real or not, that we're an expensive country to do research in. We're just generally an expensive country, I think, is the problem, to be honest. And I have to acknowledge the costing subgroup who've done a huge amount of work on this, and I would suggest again that that is a perception. The single biggest driver of costings in Ireland is workforce, and the single biggest problem in clinical research is the lack of a workforce plan to address particularly short-term recurrent contracts. So ultimately, if you do different analysis of our costings, you may suggest we're slightly more expensive. Most of that is related to national labour agreements, and we're never going to change that. So Martina Hennessy in Trinity has led this the costing subgroup, and she's done a huge amount of work looking at both internal with the costings within the country, but also externally, and also looked at different models that could be used. One of the biggest problems that any of you that run a clinical trials institution or unit can be around reimbursement and actually getting invoices out and getting paid. So it's often not just how much we cost, it's actually getting the money back in. The costings group have done an enormous amount of work, and this will all be published in our final report. But ultimately, to summarise them, what we see is that there's an agreed costing template, that we develop a centrally approved price schedule, and then that our overhead rate will be at a standard 40% for 3 years. The problem in Ireland is that in different disciplines, people are charging different overhead rates. So just to sum up, our final recommendations will really be a group of key enablers, as you can see here. There will be a group of kind of support structures and strategies, and finally then looking at how we support that CT infrastructure, that clinical trials infrastructure across the country. And I'll leave you on this thought, because really if we can develop and work on that vibrant, lean, financially viable clinical trial infrastructure, we can become a very successful country. It requires significant investment from government, and ultimately that's what's going to be the issue that's going to be the success and failure point. But if we don't do that, I think we'll be left behind, and we'll be left behind very quickly. I'd just like to thank all the members of the National Clinical Trials Oversight Group, and I'd also like to acknowledge the work done by John O'Neill and the Secretariat in the Department of Health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Brennan. Thank you. We now turn to a collaborative learning by doing initiative that was mentioned earlier. It's called Hypercare. The Institute for Clinical Trials here in Galway are supporting this as a really impactful pilot. So this national initiative is supporting several medtech companies, helping them to navigate their journey through the clinical investigation, application review and approval process here in Ireland, all the way through to patient recruitment. John Kilmartin, who's an adjunct professor here at the University of Galway, is going to present an overview of this initiative, and we're also going to hear insights from his panel. But I'll let John introduce his panel from two of the companies that have benefited from this Hypercare trial. So with that, for about the next 20 minutes, I'll hand over to you, John. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth. Yeah. So, to introduce my panel, first of all, so we have Caroline Feeney here, who's representing Intervene, and Caroline will speak to Intervene in a few moments, and Paul Devereux from the Research and Development Group at Medtronic. So I'll spend maybe about 10 minutes just giving you a little bit of background on the Hypercare initiative here at the Institute, and then we'll really hear the real lessons learned then from Caroline and Paul. So really, I think Siobhan, has very eloquently shown us the patient voice. When we spoke earlier, Tom has given us the European perspective, and Donal has spoken to what's happening from an Ireland perspective. So this is very much almost a bottoms-up learning by doing. It's not a scientific or clinical presentation per se, but it's basically showing, in my opinion, I think I've been in the medtech sector for over 25 years, mainly in industry, but I think over the last year and a half, I've probably seen more progress and goodwill also in relation to clinical trials, and particularly even from a medtech perspective. So this is kind of almost through the lens of the innovators in the room and the industry in the room, and then I think, as Professor Donal Brennan mentioned as well, all ships will rise in that, hopefully academic research also. So we're looking at how does Ireland really become a viable option, another option in the toolbox. Siobhan, you mentioned as well, a couple of weeks ago, Siobhan presented at the Future Health Summit, and I think there was three things she said. One was to be brave, which I think we are. We kind of ask for forgiveness rather than permission. You were doing this also for, Siobhan spoke with the patients that come after, so we're doing this also for the companies and the innovators that come after us. And I think the third thing I learned from Siobhan is that she also ran off at the end of the day. She had to make dinner for one of her kids. So, okay, so Ireland. We're reminding ourselves, first of all, of what we have created here. I think sometimes we forget on the drive here today. Someone mentioned at break time there that they drove past the new Dexon facility, up past the Medtronic, the Boston Scientifics, and in here into the campus, and you can see the BioInnovate. So there's a fantastic ecosystem here. By the time we finish our conference today, almost 25,000 stents will have been shipped to patients across the globe, just from a 5-mile radius, from here. So we have a fantastic ecosystem. Some of the facts and figures, many of these, you will have seen before. For example, we're probably the second largest exporter in Europe. We also the largest employer of medtech professionals per capita, in Europe. And I think the technologies are changing. Professor Sarai showed us some of that earlier, from the traditional mechanical devices to more convergent technologies, software, AI. And I think we're also really well positioned in that. This slide shows us in a European context. So almost 1 in every 100 people in the workforce here works directly in the medtech sector in Ireland. So we look at the ecosystem. We're the envy of it across the globe. We talk about the top 5 medtech hubs, in the world. Manufacturing, factory of the future, product development. We've evolved. We have the academia and physician community. But yet, from a device clinical trials perspective, and Donal will probably speak to this later, we probably have less than 10 or maybe 10 per annum of Article 62 type studies. So we probably need to take a look back first of all, and then look forward. So if we look back, time in industry, I think some of the Irish MedTech group may be here today. Almost hard to believe, almost 20 years ago, the first report that we looked at back in 2006 talked about the need for Irish patients to access and benefit from these technologies. Then in 2012, similar, we had made progress. Ireland is a location of choice. We acknowledged some progress, but still a limited number of device trials. And then probably the last report in 2019, where again, the level of medtech clinical investigations taking place is still low, considering the sector scale here. But a huge amount of progress. Any of us who've been in this industry for a long time also have to acknowledge the progress to date. And maybe about a year and a half ago, again, many of us remember the time when we didn't have the National Research Ethics, and Lucia will speak to that later today. We've all the clinical research facilities, agency support. It's good, but as we know, we need to make that better. Tom spoke about the European model, and I think that's really important, and Donald Brennan spoke to that as well, in terms of we can be a beacon within the European environment as well. And the early feasibility process through US FDA gives me hope, because they change very quickly without changing directives or regulations. They change the mindset, and the policies within the US, and that really transformed clinical research, within the US. Lord James Shaughnessy spoke probably this time last year on International Clinical Trials Day, and sometimes it's great to hear someone from the outside. I know Professor Brennan and the National Clinical Trials Group have spoken with him also, and I think one of his perspectives is, when he looks at as an outside looking in, medtech clinical investigations is a huge opportunity for us. So what do we do about it, or what are we doing about it? So I think we kind of listened. There are 5 strategic pillars within the Institute under Professor Dunn, but this particular one we decided to focus in the medtech, and also to look at, are the barriers real or are they perceived barriers? 4 momentum swings, I would argue, in the past 12 to 14 months, and these momentum swings are real. The first one, I think the panel that we'll see next, Dr. John O'Neill, Donald, etc., all attended a meeting in Dublin in April of 2024. We asked for forgiveness rather than permission for that meeting, but it was a very honest, transparent meeting, and we spoke about things such as data protection contracts and many other things. And I guess it was a difficult, thorny subject at the time. We were all wondering, how do we improve it? But one of the things that we did agree to do was to basically pilot an initiative, a small select number of candidate studies through the process, show that it can be done. And I think we'll hear that later. And then the next level of maturity for us as a country then is to show that it can be done repeatably. Second momentum swing, not to underestimate Professor Donald Brennan and much of the team that are here today. That was a fantastic, we've seen the recommendations. I think all of us, see where they're going, and executing on those will be important. We then moved into the data protection discussion. We're having really responsible, mature conversations around that now. And then into hypercare. And I guess our approach on hypercare at the Institute here was very much along the lines of a collaboration, and a real collaboration, getting into the nitty-gritty. Sometimes it's not the big ticket things. There may be perception it's HPRA questions or it's NREC questions, whatever. Often it's smaller administrative, bureaucratic things that can simply trip you up. So Professor Dunn has often said that we need to see the Institute as smoothing the pathway, navigating the pathway. So that's what we're trying to do here. Build a reputation, be reliable, redress the narrative in Ireland, and offer a viable choice. Hypercare isn't anything overly complicated. It's simply selecting some candidate investigations, helping them through the application process. The sponsors remain the sponsors, as we'll hear later from Caroline and Paul, tracking it, and then most importantly, learning from it. It's very easy to go through it. A company may go through the process. They may be frustrated with bits of it, but at least what we're trying to do here is to take those learnings and apply them. The 3-legged stool I often refer to, one of those is HPRA in terms of the regulatory, the NREC and the ethics process, and the third leg of the stool then is the HSE, the hospital infrastructure. We need all of those to be working, in order to have a steady seat. The feedback from the pilot companies I'll hold for the moment. I think it's been a very progressive and interactive dialogue, and we'll hear that in a few minutes, so I won't pause on this for a moment. Learnings to date. Looking at it now, I would say there's a palpable change in the narrative from an Ireland Inc. perspective, whether it's innovation, whether it's academia, whether it's the work that the national team have done. I think you'll hear now in a moment, we're showing that it can work, but we need to show that then consistently and predictably. So we'll hear lots of examples. We need to make the examples become the norm. And I think, as Tom Melvin said, we also need to be ambitious and for Ireland, learn from others. Let's learn, what did FDA do? Why are some of the maybe bioinnovate companies going to Georgia or Uzbekistan? Why are Denmark and, as you spoke, to Trial Nation? Let's learn from all of them. There's probably snippets from each of them that we can take, select the right type of studies for this country, share the feedback, and build a reputation. I would concur with Professor Brennan, is that I do think we can, our size can actually be to our advantage in being a beacon for certain types of high impact clinical research. So that's the background. What I'd like to do now is I would like to maybe let Caroline and Paul share some of their perspectives, having gone through it, warts and all, in relation to hypercare. So I'll stay here in case I'm not mic'd up, but so we might start with yourself, Caroline, and maybe just introduce yourself, the company that you're representing, and then just to give the audience a sense of, for your company, why did you choose Ireland? And just give us maybe your initial perspectives on hypercare to date.
Sure. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, John. So Caroline Feeney is my name. Have been in the industry for 20 odd years at this stage, now working as a consultant and helping a small team in Redwood City, California. They're a startup developing a novel thrombectomy product. They have an experienced leadership team there who have some experience of the Irish medtech infrastructure in the past. They have had links through Stanford Biodesign into BioInnovate as an example. And they saw a huge opportunity to get involved in a clinical trial here. One of the reasons especially is that Professor Jerry O'Sullivan, who's a KOL in the venous space, is somebody they'd worked with before and obviously based locally here. So that was a big attraction. And then the chance for a small startup to get involved in a hypercare framework was really big for them, because it offered the chance to get some help, frankly, to navigate some of the uncertainty with the application process here. And I'd say, the experience to date has been really, really superb. And part of that is down to the hypercare team at the Institute. That group of people has a diverse range of experience, from industry expertise to experienced clinical trialists to folks that have a lot of operational expertise. So being able to help us navigate through the system there has been hugely helpful. So that's initial perspective, John, and happy to talk to more of the detail in a bit.
Thanks, Caroline. And I think from a smaller, maybe scaling company to the large Medtronic, Paul, who has huge experience globally on clinical trials. So yeah, if you would mind sharing your initial perspectives, Paul, also.
Yep, thanks, John. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Paul Devereux. I'm R&D Program Director at Medtronic and currently working with a team looking at an early feasibility study. For us, we look at clinical trials or clinical evaluations being that final piece of the puzzle when we look at product development. Professor Melvin gave a really good presentation a few minutes ago about all the parts that are required for product development. For Medtronic in Galway, we can probably do 90% of those activities in Galway, yet we export our clinical trials out of the country. So we took this opportunity, especially with a key opinion leader like Professor Sharif, who you met earlier, in the space of renal denervation, so to leverage his expertise, but then also the opportunity to work with the Institute. So again, it was this can-do attitude, a new approach, maybe a way of approaching the clinical trial landscape. So for us, it's building out the capability in this country to go from start to finish for medical device development is probably a priority.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. So that's kind of your initial impressions, and then I think obviously this has been a pilot. One of the things that we've spoken about through this is we want to do lessons learned. We want to kind of learn, whether it's the small stuff or the big stuff. What can we do better? Whether that's HPRA, NREC, the hospital infrastructure, or the sponsor. So where do you see are the areas and opportunities that we as a country, Ireland, needs to focus on from an improvement perspective if we want to make this hypercare model, which has been successful? How do we make it sustainable? Maybe Caroline first.
Yeah, sure. So I think, unsurprisingly, the clinical application process is complex given the number of stakeholders that are involved. Maybe to use your analogy from earlier on the three-legged stool, NREC and the HPRA, they're single entities. But if you take the hospital and the HSE, that's an amalgam of, multiple departments and functions covering everything from data protection, radiation protection, to clinical services. So navigating that is not easy. Now, I will say we had a lot of help from the hypercare team. John, because his industry expertise, speaks our language and can translate a little bit for sponsors. And a call out to Aoife. Aoife has done phenomenal work in navigating the system and the document flow. And I think, frankly, has shielded us from maybe a lot of the complexity. But the advice, I think, would be that individual effort is great and much appreciated. But for this effort to scale, it's going to require, more systems, more process, so that things become more repeatable. And, that could be simple things like, enhanced checklists or enhanced guidance. Not difficult, but just having the energy to do that. So I think that would be big. Um, I think as well, this is Intervene is a small US based company, so there are differences for non-EU sponsors. So, things like data privacy or data protection is more complicated. You've got to find a EU legal rep. So, just bearing all that in mind, I think is important if we want to become that beacon that you touched on. Startups are juggling an awful lot. So frankly, any guidance or help that they can get, they're going to appreciate. So I think just keeping the focus there. And maybe lastly, keeping that collaborative mindset and that can do continuous improvement mindset, that goes a long way. And sponsors see it. Give some feedback and the feedback gets taken on board. That's a big deal. So I think there are three things, John, that would help.
Thanks. And yourself, Paul?
Yep, thanks, John. Again, I agree with everything that Caroline said, but I think for us, we're currently looking to enroll patients. So we made our submissions towards the end of February to both NREC and to HPRA. And here we are now sitting looking to enroll patients. That's a phenomenal achievement, and we've set a really high bar. And so internally in Medtronic, we'll be asking the questions, well, how do we do that across the country? We've been able to leverage the fact that Professor Sharif is here and the Institute is here. But a company the size of Medtronic, we deal with not only cardiovascular diseases, but we work in neuromodulation, robotics, pain management. So we will have KOLs in other parts of the country that we will want to work with. And how do we ensure that those KOLs and that those trials go through as smoothly as possible as well? So we've achieved what we set out to achieve, and I think we probably exceeded our own internal expectations. We've set a bar for ourselves that we need to look to continuously meet. And I suppose the question back to this audience is, how do we ensure that happens?
Perfect. Yeah. Thanks, Paul and Caroline. Yeah, and I think maybe also to clarify from a hypercare perspective, we set ourselves out. We left our rules pretty loose in the beginning, but we wanted a multinational. We wanted a US maybe scaling company. We wanted an Irish indigenous company. So we want to make sure that we cover different sizes and scales, because the challenges may differ in terms of the company's expertise as well. And also beyond, we've heard a lot today in relation to vascular and cardiovascular, but also going beyond that, I think that's really important for us as well. So your point, Caroline and Paul, in terms of scaling it, I think that's important for all of us, and that is through systems and proceduralizing it, not overly burdensome, but being smart and flexible in relation to how we set those up. So I appreciate your comments on it. So yeah, so maybe for the audience, before we finish up, I think we've 2 minutes, and I can see Ruth's hiding, coming around the corner in the background. So I'll give the final word back to the two hypercare companies to date. So I think we've heard what's working well. We've heard where the challenge is in terms of scaling as we go forward. Any final thoughts for the audience here? I'll leave the last word, Caroline, with yourself and Paul.
Yeah, well, I'll start it with kind of the end point I was going to make. I can categorically say, Intervene wouldn't be where they are today without having been part of the hypercare process. So strongly encourage any company that has the opportunity to get involved to get involved. I could name 4 or 5 things. I'll try and keep it to 3 as to, what I think standouts are. I think that early and consistent engagement with the key stakeholders from the outset. The Institute helped us facilitate some face-to-face meetings at the very beginning. They were really important, and I probably can't overstate the importance of being able to put a face with some of these regulatory bodies, because frankly, there's a bit and sometimes a lot of apprehension with dealing with regulatory bodies. But once you make that connection, it kind of demystifies it and builds the trust. And it makes things that much smoother going forward. I'd say that's really important. And then I think that collaborative approach, we saw it all the way through. I see Lucia there, for example, with NREC, we got around to questions on the original submission, that happens. But the guys were very quick to accept a call where the intervene team talked them through what their proposed responses were. And, we got alignment. And then when the formal submission went in, it was so much smoother. So, practical things like that are absolutely great. The regular check-ins with the Institute were great as well. And, we can see that there are roadblocks, reality is they come up, but having a forum to be able to discuss them and to see that the lessons learned are being taken and shared, it's been phenomenal. So it's been positive.
The last 20 seconds, Paul.
Again, very briefly, just to echo that, the collaborative nature. I mean, there was a conference in Medtronic last October, 12 months. There was a clinical trials conference. And one of the key takeaways that I took from that message was at a HPRA presentation that it was clearly stated, come talk to us, we're friendly. We definitely took them up on that offer during this early feasibility study. It was an open door policy, and it definitely helped speed our process through for approval.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And yeah, and my final word I would say is that, first of all, thanks to the companies, to be brave enough and come up and share their experience. It's great to hear it. People like to hear what's the real life. We can come up here and say, hey, theoretically. So thank you. And in particular, thanks to the other stakeholders, HPRA, NREC, and others, and the hospital infrastructure. And we'll hear a little bit about that in the next panel. So appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much to John, Caroline, and Paul. Thank you. So far in this session, I think, we've been given that real sense of urgency from Siobhan that we have to get on with this. We have to be brave and we have to do it in a way that is inclusive. But I think, from Tom Donal and the panel just now, we've heard, real signs that everyone in the system is trying to push forward and take this opportunity that we have here in front of us in Ireland. But now, for about the next half hour or so, we're going to turn our attention to a panel of experts who are all contributing significantly through their own work and the work of their agencies and departments at a national level towards these common goals. So I'd like to introduce our panel. We have Dr. John O'Neill from the Department of Health, and I invite you all to join me here on the stage. We have Dr. Donal O'Connor from the Health Products Regulatory Authority, Dr. Lucia Predova from the National Office for Research Ethics Committees, and Dr. Septa Duffy from Enterprise Ireland. Unfortunately, Professor Mary Horgan has had to leave us, but we're so grateful to Mary for coming down and speaking to us this morning.
Where?
I was going to stand at the lectern, but I'd be very far away from all of you. So I think I'll come over here instead. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to kick off the discussion to kind of get a sense of what your organisations are doing in the whole area of clinical trials and optimising the clinical trial environment here in Ireland. And I suppose particularly thinking about what other positive changes you can tell us about, because I think we've heard about some of that already from our speakers so far. Could I start with you, John? Your role involves development of research and innovation policy within the Department of Health, and that's a relatively newly established department. Can you tell us about the work of your group and I suppose how you're ensuring that research and innovation is getting into the wider health system and I suppose into patient care ultimately?
Sure. Thanks, Ruthie, and good afternoon, everybody. Yeah, my name is John O'Neill, so I'm head of a relatively new kind of research policy and innovation unit within the department. We were set up about kind of 14 months ago, so the honeymoon period is well and truly over at this stage. But I think it was a really good signal from the department to set up a second unit that had a very strong focus on research. And effectively, I suppose, kind of our unit is much more of an external facing unit. So it's really about kind of trying to engage kind of more widely with the external stakeholders. That doesn't say that we don't engage internally as well. But so key things for us, I suppose, kind of which are relevant to the discussions here today would be kind of we work very closely with the HRB, so the Health Research Board. We have oversight of the HRB, and they have a long-standing kind of success story with supporting the CRFs. We also work very closely with the HSC in kind of with Anna Therese and her team on the research side as that kind of process evolves about trying to embed research and innovation kind of within the regions. And then we work kind of more widely across government departments and agencies through Impact 2030, but actually trying to widen the kind of the health agenda where it crosses over other government departments. And maybe we'll come back to that. So obviously there is some key kind of areas of work. Kind of Donald mentioned the oversight group that we have, and I suppose within the HSC then we will be kind of working very closely with colleagues there on the genomics agenda as well. And that's really important because it has links back obviously into the clinical trial side of things as well. So that's a kind of a quick kind of overview.
Very broad mandate there. Septa, can I come to you? I mean, you play a pivotal role at Enterprise Ireland as the head of life sciences and health tech. And that's, again, a very broad area of responsibility within that sector. But can you tell us sort of what Enterprise Ireland is doing in this space? I saw your name there in terms of the clinical trials group. And how does this sort of tie into Enterprise Ireland's overall strategy for innovation?
So good afternoon, everybody. So Enterprise Ireland support over 4,000 Indigenous businesses in the manufacturing and internationally traded services sector. In life sciences and health tech, we have just about 400 companies, so 10% of the portfolio, and this covers everything from med tech, pharma, diagnostics, and digital health. And we go from the very early stage, where we're helping to invest in early stage companies, to supporting later stage companies with grants and so on, and access to international markets where we have 42 international offices. So we have, like I said, different supports for different stages, whether that's investments or grants for incentivizing research and development, innovation, digitalization, leadership development, and so on. We know we prioritize early stage companies quite a lot. The medtech sector here in Galway is one of our key performers. So last year we invested over 27 million in 157 very early stage companies, like seed investments at this stage, and 28 of those were in the life sciences and health tech sector. We know that these companies want to have the option to do clinical trials here locally, but currently the majority of those are going overseas. So we want to change that. We want to bring some of that home. We know it's extra work on the companies, it's extra costs on the companies, and effectively Ireland Inc. is losing out on all of this. So we welcomed the opportunity to be part of the National Clinical Trials Oversight Group and the work that's going on there, the work that the hypercare team, and we want to build on all of that and make sure that any obstacles that are there are removed, but to work collaboratively with the ecosystem. The trials, and we've heard it all morning, clinical trials involve collaboration and partnership, as Siobhan was saying, but it also needs infrastructure and funding is one of those integral parts for Enterprise Ireland. So we continuously fund companies to do R&D, whether that's through R&D grant supports or innovation partnerships with the university systems, but also we have the Disruptive Technology Innovation Fund that some people may be familiar with. We administer that for the government. It's a 500 million grant support to companies. And within that, within industrial research projects, companies can partake in clinical trials here locally. So that would be really good to see more companies use that route. To date, 249 million has been approved to 60 companies, and some of those are using that support. So it's about, incentivizing companies to do more of the activity here and taking away barriers. So
thank you, Steph. That's great. I mean, Donal, I think the other thing we've heard about as well is regulation, and obviously, how central is the HPRA in terms of creating that enabling landscape, making sure that everything is done. I think that lovely phrase, innovation at the speed of trust, in a way where we know things are safe, that they're reliable, and we continue to have that. It's also very reputationally important. We have it in our pharma sector that this is a good, safe place to do things.
Well, I think that it's important to set out. It's probably two distinct, I suppose, main areas where we have to prioritise our activity. One is on the EU level, in terms of general contribute to regulatory standards, regulatory efficiency, and trying to enable innovation. And then more locally and nationally, but they're not mutually exclusive. So I suppose on the EU level, currently and relatively recently, there's been a lot of work done by regulators to try and overcome some of the challenges that, in general terms, Prof. Brennan alluded to around efficiencies and the burden of doing clinical trials, I suppose, agnostic of technology, or it's medicines or medtech, and more specifically highlighted by Professor Melvin around the excessive, I suppose, almost redundant application process if you're doing a multinational study. Now, the efficiency there really is going to be for your larger players, your multinational entities, but obviously there's an advantage for patients in Ireland and the clinicians who want to be investigators. So what started this year is a pilot for coordinated assessment. So instead of for a sponsor who wants to run a multinational study in Europe, instead of having to go country by country for their clinical trial for a new medical device or a new in vitro diagnostic, there's an opportunity now to do a coordinated single assessment. And HPRA are one of only 6 country regulators represent member states in Europe who have volunteered to be one of the coordinating or main assessment bodies for those clinical trials, which hopefully will lead to more of those large multinational so-called pivotal studies, as Tom would have alluded to, those pre-market studies, which may facilitate our very, I suppose, brave and skilled investigators who want to take on running those studies for the benefit of their patients in their clinics and get potentially earlier access to some of those more innovative, certainly higher risk but impactful devices. It's already now established for clinical trials for medicines. So obviously I'm predominantly responsible for devices. One of my colleagues, Claire Temple, is in the audience, who runs the clinical trial for medicines portfolio in HPRA. So that coordinated assessment to allow a more streamlined multinational registration of clinical trials for medicines has already established. Typically in Ireland, we'd see about 100 clinical trials for medicines registered per year, but it looks like this year hopefully will be a good year. I think by already the end of May, 60 have been registered. And relevant to some of our early speakers, close to 50% are in the oncology hematology space. Now, bringing it back to some of the national initiatives, a lot of that, I suppose, is typically driven by multinationals on the pharma side, and the later phase, the pivotal studies, where maybe some Irish centres and maybe a smaller proportion of the larger patient population will be enrolled. But obviously that's really important to access to those innovative medicines. Probably on the medtech side, and a bit of a synergy with the initiatives from Enterprise Ireland and who they're trying to support, and it all still fits with the department's mission about increasing the number of trials. On the medtech side, even though the volume is lower, as Tom said, we need to increase that. And John as well, we're only seeing 10 or a little bit more than 10 clinical investigations or clinical trials for new devices per year being registered. But the proportion that are in that national only, either established industry or that sort of SME early academic spin out is actually close to about 40%. That's a proportion that you wouldn't see either nationally or across Europe, in terms of medicines, where it'll be 90 plus, obviously multinational. So some of the initiatives there to I suppose to drive is putting our money where our mouth is a little bit, prioritizing in our service plans, in our resourcing, that those sponsors, those potential developers, they need extra assistance. Because we want a really high standard, but they need extra assistance in terms of extra pre-submission meetings, that type of contact feedback, even facilitating inter-submission meetings, so we can take a call to explain that difficult question during that. I suppose for the patients, for the benefit of any patients and their advocates here in the audience, it's not about speeding up the process for the sake of it. It's not about making it any easier. We're in a really high standard. It's about making it more feasible and predictable for those sponsors to hit that high standard.
And it's even like coming back to what Caroline said, having the name of someone, it's not a faceless organization that you're dealing with. It's not about dropping the standards, but it's about making it more accessible for people through prioritizing resources there. Maybe Lucia, coming to you now, the establishment of the National Office and the National Research Ethics Committees was a step change in Ireland. But can you talk to me now how the office is streamlining ethical approvals and how it's helping researchers and those doing clinical trials here in Ireland to collaborate with their European partners?
Yeah, so the National Office was established 5 years ago, about 2 weeks before lockdowns. So it's been a steep learning curve for us, but I suppose the reason why the National Office was established was to really facilitate ethics review for clinical trials and for clinical investigations, and to provide national assessment, because previously researchers would have to go and sponsors to each hospital separately. So we now issue a national decision. Now, it again changes slightly differently for our colleague in clinical trials, because now that assessment happens on the EU level. So there, the collaboration is again further enhanced, because it's a single submission process for the entire EU for ethics and for also the HPRI assessment. For the clinical investigations, the practical application has been slightly different. So it is, we do our bits separately, but again, we work very closely together on aligning across the area. And I suppose we also, as a national office, we participate in the European groups that try and form the guidances for all the European countries to form the various templates. So we've been learning a lot from our clinical trials colleagues and trying to align with them. So it's very predictable for sponsors. So we will be updating very shortly our templates to again align with them. So it is much more streamlined process in terms of the submission. The ethics is ethics, but again, I suppose trying to minimize the administration that comes into the submission as much as feasible is what we've been really trying to focus on.
Yeah, thank you. John, can I come back to you now? Because obviously, throughout the day, it's been clear that this is a collaborative effort, and many of the organisations and people who have been speaking here today, sort of on one level, feed up to the Department of Health or the Department of Further and Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science, or the Department of Enterprise. So I suppose how at government level are we thinking about making sure this isn't fragmented, and how are we thinking about making the case for the budget when we see it crossing over departments? And that can be a real challenge for civil servants like yourself, where you're only responsible for one bit, but we need to try and get that coordination. So can you talk to us about how that's working, or any plans to improve it?
Yeah, I think it's kind of key actually, because the fragmentation, I think, is probably the biggest challenge. And probably we're pretty good at that in Ireland, across every kind of area of policy possibly. And I think that the key thing, just thinking about kind of the stakeholders and just even, the oversight group that Donald mentioned, and we have kind of 4 or 5 members in the audience. It's really key that you have kind of, I suppose, that kind of overview of the input that you need from public, private, academia, public and the patient side of things as well. So you do need a really informed kind of consensus at the kind of very highest level. But then, kind of around the fragmentation piece is kind of, there's so many inefficiencies in terms of kind of maybe kind of how we do things. So we've heard about that a lot, and processes and kind of so forth. Now, lots has been achieved, but there's probably 2 aspects to it. So we do need obviously to think about investment into the future, but we also need to think about if we're going to do something about the fragmentation, we're obviously going to make savings on the efficiencies within the system that we can kind of generate. And I think that's kind of really important. So I think that has to happen in tandem with kind of getting to that really even kind of, I suppose, more awkward challenge of kind of how do you take a whole of government kind of response to this in terms of funding. Donald mentioned earlier, and he's right, we shouldn't pin all our hopes on a kind of a life sciences strategy, because we're kind of, that's in the mix at the moment. But I think that will be really important, at least we hope so, in terms of having an overarching framework that can make it more strategic about kind of everything that we are trying to do. So it wouldn't necessarily just be clinical trials, but it'd be everything around that, and it will be the wider aspect of clinical trials, kind of, so that we aren't just talking about commercial trials on medicinal products and kind of so forth. So I think kind of there is that kind of a challenge of kind of how do we kind of make sure that we have the right people around the table. That whole of government approach to making sure that this is really kind of key within life sciences, within biotech, that we kind of connect the dots, because we don't do that very well to some degree either. And I think if we can kind of do that, I think the argument becomes much more clear about the impact we can have. Because once we connect everything a bit more, I think the impact, or the potential for impact, can be significant.
And obviously, when the National Oversight Group for Clinical Trials actually reads out its final report, that may be an opportunity as well for people to get behind a call for dedicated streams of funding to support that work.
Yeah, and I think, it's been mentioned a couple of times already this morning, but the kind of, and maybe not the exact term, but the timing is good, I think, at the moment. There's a kind of there is a sense, in the program for government, we have kind of references to clinical trials. We have references to, you know, kind of aspects around genomics and so forth. And again, you can't rest all your hopes on kind of what's in the program for government. But but there are things kind of aligning that we can kind of see. Kind of obviously, the oversight group is going to be going to government with its final recommendations over the next month or so. And I think that process of kind of taking the opportunity that's there to kind of maybe kind of look at again signposting towards the life sciences strategy of kind of this could be a very critical pillar of that in terms of kind of what we're trying to do in Ireland. So I think for me, it kind of does feel like the timing is kind of right. There's an awful lot of work to be done, but I think this is really good from an opportunity point of view where we are right now.
Absolutely. Coming back to you, Donal, I mean, you talked there about some of the ways that the HPRA is engaging with people who are conducting trials to help smooth their journey. I mean, if you look forward kind of on your roadmap of other things that you would like to do as an organisation to again feed into that Ireland as a global hub for trials, are there any other aspects that you can talk to us about that are coming down the track?
Sure, absolutely. And again, I'll probably split it quickly into European and national. Just a minute, I suppose at the European level, relevant to both trials for devices and pharma trials, and particularly it's really driven by the importance of new trials for oncology. So for Professor Brennan and his patients and similar investigators, there's the Combine project that they may have mentioned, which is to try and improve the efficiency and reduce the administrative burden of doing trials where not only is an IMP, not only is a new medicine being investigated, but in terms of precision medicine, the assay or the blood test or the biopsy that's going to determine enrollment into the trial. At the moment, that's subject to individual approvals for the device aspect of the trial. So in the Combine project, which the pilot has just launched, again, the sponsor who can have the single assessment process if it's multinational for the medicine side can also have that now for the in vitro diagnostic side. And again, the HPRA and Ireland are one of a small minority of countries who volunteered to be lead assessors in that pilot, and hopefully there'll be some submissions, I think, coming in August or September. I suppose that's important in driving the Europe, not only Ireland, as an enabling landscape for conducting even those pivotal pre-market studies, particularly in the area of oncology. Back to it, maybe something we're driving just ourselves internally is to try and develop a bit of subspecialization really in the area of those first in human or early feasibility studies, and we've seen some lovely examples of them for the higher risk devices, where probably taking advantage a little bit of some of the other synergies and advantages that we have here nationally in terms of the expertise and the attitude of some of our investigators and indeed our patients who are willing to be part of these trials, where it could be a very impactful intervention, but there is risk and there's uncertainty because it hasn't been trialed yet in humans, and there's a limit to how much preclinical work you can do. So there's a bit of a challenge for all the stakeholders there. You need very skilled investigators. You need your expertise in your hospitals. You need willing ethics committees to take on those difficult challenges, because sometimes there mightn't be that same individual benefit. It might be more leading towards a benefit for patient groups down the line. There's obviously challenges in patient recruitment because it could be difficult, could be less known about the technology. It's obviously a lot of opportunities because we're talking about the breakthrough technologies that potentially are very impactful. They could completely change how a particular disease is treated. So if we go back to the example from 20 years ago, open heart surgery versus minimally invasive ways of replacing valves. So to develop a bit of subspecialization in that space means a bit of challenging ourselves as regulators, but working with European partners, we've established an assessors forum to try and challenge our own attitude so we can to get our risk appetite in the right place. Because again, it's about protecting anyone who's going to be enrolled in the trial, but being pragmatic. It also, I think, is one area that it's agnostic of the size of the potential sponsor or developer. So not only the academic spin out who might be going to SEPTA for help, but the multinationals also need assistance, because it's difficult to know, as Tom mentioned, you have to get sufficient clinical evidence. It's not prescriptive on how you achieve that. So regulators have to meet with those, even if they're very experienced multinational sponsors, and trying to get that, improve that predictability. Again, we want a really high bar for all the studies right up until they start to put that device into our patients, and really good supervision. But you have to be able to provide that type of pre-submission process, spend a bit of time. It challenges the attitudes of our regulators. the acceptability of some of this, the risk appetite is different amongst regulators. So we're putting a lot of work in that. It's on our service plan this year to work with the early feasibility studies, make that an area of specialization. And just to briefly mention, the advantage, I suppose, for regulators of initiatives like the Clinical Trials Institute and the Hypercare is there's a bit of a pre-screening and a triage there. So when the people come to us, they're that little bit more prepared so they can get better use of that service.
Yeah, and look, it's that whole area of be brave as well, isn't it? And that kind of it leads me into my next question for you, Lucia. So you also have to balance this role. You know, you trust is clearly a very important part of your role. You know, you're sort of the custodians of safeguarding participants' dignity, their their autonomy in the study, making sure that they're properly informed. So how do you as an organization balance that sort of responsibility combined with wanting to make sure that the other voice of patients, that voice of patients that says be brave, we need to try things, how do you balance those things?
So I suppose as the national office, our first and foremost role is to support our ethics committees to have all the information to make really comprehensive decision with the view of the participant, but also the greater population, as Donald has already alluded to. And I mean, we couldn't do this without our members. My members are phenomenal. They commit so much of their time. There's 90 of them that show up every month for a meeting, and they are willing to hop on a phone and do this so that we, again, don't delay those studies and that we get decisions done efficiently. And for us as the national office, in order to make their job easier, we really like to work with sponsors to make sure that their applications are completed comprehensively, that everything that needs to be there is there, so that they're not necessarily wasting their time talking about, but the participant information leaflet says this, but the protocol says this, so which one it is. So I suppose, again, just making sure that the applications are really solid and that they're very clear, and that there is a lot of, I suppose, the committee can really focus on the core of the issue, which is, again, the participant well-being and the greater good. And I suppose the Hypercare project has been phenomenal, again, in highlighting some of the things that we sort of assumed about ourselves. So we were like, we're sound, come to us, talk to us. But actually, we never really advertised that, and the benefit of that early engagement, the benefit of, if you're not clear what's in the decision letter and you would like to talk to us, we can probably help you with clarify those points in terms of what is the committee trying to, what is the information they're looking for. So again, on the foot of that initiative, we are now implementing pre-submission meetings, and we're going to really look at how we support, especially clinician investigators in their submissions, because again, for them, without the backing of CRO and a big team to complete application, I suppose, form under the regulations is a massive task. So that's one thing. And I suppose the other thing is, as Donal already said, working closely with our colleagues in HPRA and on those key projects such as the Combine. So again, it's going to be a huge game changer if it works, and hopefully it does. Because currently that sponsor has to go to 4 different bodies, and that's just in Ireland. So imagine doing precision medicine trials in Europe. Like, it's a massive burden. So that's one thing. And then working with John and his team, and I suppose seeing, is there anything we can do to I suppose, look at the regulation to make sure that we can stay agile, that it's not really holding us back in making sure that, again, we become more attractive and that we can provide really solid, comprehensive and efficient service to sponsors without compromising on the participants.
And I think, look, for any regulator globally, as the pace of research, accelerates, we're going to be talking a bit about that later this afternoon. We do need our regulators to be agile because we need to stay ahead of this. Septa, can I come back to you? You mentioned when you were speaking earlier about companies having to take their trials outside of Ireland. And obviously one of the goals here is to try and think about how we can capture more of these here. And you touched on hypercare as well. I mean, given that we've seen such positive outcomes from hypercare, do we just sort of need to scale that so it's available for everybody? Or what is the opportunity? What do you see as the scale of the opportunity if we can get this right?
I think, like, being brave and being ambitious, we can go anywhere with this, and that's kind of what's in our nature. So we welcome all of that as a starting initiative, but we need to continue the collaboration, continue academic, hospital, industry, government, all collaborating together to kind of lift all parts of the ecosystem, not just any one part individually, but all of the ecosystem. So look, as an agency of the government, we'll continue to work with the enterprises, to work with the infrastructure that we can influence to try and work with that. So look, to us, we don't see anywhere that this can stop, and our sister agency in the IDA would be in the same position as us. We want to be here to accommodate, to help remove any obstacles that are there.
Yeah, been lucky enough to work with both you. I know how closely you work together. You know, it's
Yeah.
rarely that you're not both in the room together for all of these critical decisions. And I think it's really important that people understand that, you know, that
Absolutely,
it's
yeah.
always hand in glove for the whole sector.
Yeah.
It's not one or the other.
No, I mean, it's a key sector for the country.
For the
so,
country,
yeah.
exactly, exactly. Maybe just, I will be coming to the audience for questions in just a moment, but maybe John, coming back to you. I mean, we've talked about sort of collaboration, and we've talked about resourcing, but and you actually talked about maybe we can even find efficiencies. But are there things we need to look at in terms of decision making? So when it comes to things like you know, the different hospital groups and their autonomy to make decisions, are there other things we can change that might not even cost us anything?
Yeah, no, it's I think, I mean, obviously Donald would have covered some of this, but it's really interesting when we kind of had these discussions within the group around kind of, I suppose, the current interpretation of kind of how things are. And it goes back to what I think John mentioned it and one or two others mentioned as well. Kind of, it's a cultural thing, a mindset thing maybe that was there as well, kind of around how we do certain things and how we've been doing certain things over time, combined with the interpretation of kind of the regs themselves. And I think it's around trying to kind of give guidance on that and kind of maybe kind of, so that's something that we're kind of hoping to do, as Donald said, in the next few weeks, that we publish guidance as part of kind of the overall recommendations and kind of going to government, that we kind of take some of the kind of mystique out of it, or the kind of whatever, to say, look, this is relatively straightforward. You know, what we're trying to move to is kind of a very streamlined landscape, where we don't need to be kind of continually kind of having independent reviews and kind of so forth and all that. So I think it is a mindset thing as well, that we just need to move kind of forward with a kind of a slightly different mindset. And I think with that, there is that challenge around decision making that's always going to be within the system. So it's trying to maybe promote a much more innovative way about kind of how we do things. And like you were saying, we're probably moving into an area where kind of the future of trials is going to be very different to where we are right now. So we need to think of that too. So we can't just be kind of maybe kind of, obviously we're trying to really improve the current landscape, but we got to think of the future too, and kind of what that landscape is going to look like, and be ready for it. And from that point of view, again, it's been mentioned being agile, but I think also kind of in terms of the dynamic interactions between all the different arms of government, agencies and so forth as well, and being able to kind of do things a bit quicker. So it's about kind of trying to kind of maybe again break down the silo, maybe kind of stuff to some degree, but it is that kind of how to say, agility and dynamism about trying to kind of move forward. Yeah.
And as someone said earlier, our size has got to be an advantage there. You know, we have to turn that to advantage. Now, we have a little bit of time for some questions for the panel. So if anyone has any questions, so maybe someone will be brave and ask the first question of the day. Professor Sir Royce? Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you very much. I think that the question I would like to pose is that historically, did we miss the boat of the train of the bus? Depends on which country you are. Did we miss the bus with the European Union around 2012, 2015? I'm saying that because at that time, you will remember, there was two device scandal. One was the hip prosthesis in cobalt chrome, and the other was, of course, the implant of silicone for the breast. And then the European Union get very concerned by that. And there was a young senator, I will not mention his name, who get in the game. And the European Union asked the European Society of Cardiology to create a task force for device. And I had the privilege to be the chairman, and the co-chairman was Stefan Windecker. And we did a good job. We produced a document of 100 pages that in Brussels I gave to the famous senator, and we didn't hear anything after that. So by frustration, we published that as an executive summary in the European Heart Journal. But at that time, we start to have, with Martin Simoens, which is Dutch, and was president of the European Society, we start to have some interesting dialogue with the European Union. And in this dialogue, we try to do two things. First, to reduce the number of notifying body, 80 at that time, not specialized. You could have an approval by a competent authority in country, no offense, Bulgaria or Romania and so on. And we succeed in reducing the notifying body, which is the profitable bodies. But then we had the gut, we were bold by saying, what about the competent authority? Because the FDA is a congressional function, enterprise. And that was really a yet. I mean, it was impossible to say you have 28 countries in Europe, you have 28 competent authority. If all these people were working together, there would be first a severe reduction of manpower, but maybe more efficient. And that was absolutely no way to go. Is that at that moment a missed opportunity? Because if you see that Europe now is talking about defense and rearming all the countries, and you see all the budget jumping in the Netherlands, it goes from 0.8% to 5% suddenly. Did we miss at that time a dialogue about creating a European FDA?
Thank you very much. So the question is, did we miss an opportunity to create a European FDA?
That's a good question, and that question tends to fill out the entire agenda for 3-day meetings of the regulatory affairs that you're probably familiar with. You may not know that I've joined your colleague Stephen Vindiger to write 1 or 2 articles about how we can try and progress regulation for certainly in certain areas, high-risk cardiovascular devices. So maybe in brief, rather than try and go over the 10 years, I'll put a positive spin, I'll try. So rather than miss the bus or the train, maybe the train didn't leave the station when it should have. It's still stuck there, and there's still a bit of time to influence it positively when it gets going and gets over some inertia. There's lots of merits to that centralized approval body for medical devices, equivalent to what the FDA have. Clearly, there's been a lot of realized efficiencies from the decentralized system in terms of the mass availability and generally lack of shortages, until relatively recently, of most medical devices, and relatively smooth market availability. Lots of downsides. There has been the governance and the robust data assessment wasn't universally always there. Why there wasn't maybe as many mishaps and patient harm is that some of the higher risk devices tend to be in highly specialized areas, interventional cardiovascular interventions, where the professional societies sort of police and the guideline writers police what's happened, and probably similar in gynecology, oncology, and surgical oncology, etc. So I think we are moving now. So some of that work that was done by yourself and colleagues and Alan Fraser and maybe more recently even Tom Melvin and other people hasn't been completely wasted or ignored. There's probably some discussion about centralization of certain key aspects, some of it related to trying to improve clinical trial landscape, and that might be in centralizing scientific advice even for certain high-risk devices, so that if the advice is given, it'll be more reliable and predictable, that whoever the approval body is, be it FDA, yes, still the individual notified bodies in Europe, more likely to accept that. I think a lot of work has been done to improve the standard of the notified bodies. So while we're one step removed from that direct assessment of the final device portfolio, we do inspect them. I think their standards have certainly improved. And again, most players, most actors in the area were good faith actors, I think, but clearly the system had to be made more robust. The unintended consequences has become more difficult to transition some of the devices. That has unintended consequences of lack of availability of certain devices, particularly maybe in certain areas, like areas where you can only do small studies anyway to develop your evidence, orphan medicines. And HPRA and a few other like-minded regulators have done some work recently to try and improve the predictability and make it a bit more realistic to get those devices, onto the market. We're currently working on breakthrough technology to give again some more prescriptive assistance or guidance for industry. So that, again, we expect high standards of clinical data prior to the device going on the market, which, for example, as you mentioned, that hip example of many years ago, that wasn't available, so that doesn't happen again. But we need to make that system more predictable so the sponsors and developers, have a bit of a realistic roadmap. We also want the system to be there that the investigators who are willing to take on that role have some assurances that there's good quality assessments, for the areas that they're not expert in, design verification and these various things like that. So to finish, yes, there was an opportunity potentially missed 10 years ago. I don't think it's completely gone though, to be positive, and I think there's some positive change on the way. But thanks very much for a very important comment and question.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for your optimism. Are there any other questions for our panel? Yes, gentlemen here. We'll get a microphone to you.
Thanks very much. Just by way of introduction, I'm Michael O'Dwyer. I'm Professor of Hematology in the university here. I also have a background, deep involvement in research in cell therapy, including founding probably the only indigenous cell therapy company in Ireland, ONK Therapeutics. And my comment really relates to the fact that I think that there's a wonderful ecosystem around medical devices in Ireland. I think there's a lot of joined up thinking. I think there's incredible potential, of course, to take full advantage of that in terms of translating a lot of these innovations into clinical trials. But what I'd like to ask the panel is, if we're not going to miss another train, to use the recent analogy, is there similar joined up thinking around how are we going to get Ireland to catch up in terms of cell therapy? Because this is a juggernaut that's coming down the tracks. I've just returned from a meeting in Milan, the European Hematology Association, which followed on from a recent ASCO meeting. And in one particular disease, which is my own area of specialty in multiple myeloma, recent data have come out showing that with CAR T-cell therapy, it's now possible to effectively cure 1/3 of late stage patients, which is something completely unheard of previously with CAR T-cell therapy. This treatment, in fact, is approved in Europe, but of course it's not reimbursed here, and it's unlikely that this treatment would be available here for a number of years because of reimbursement issues. However, through clinical trials, we can make this and other similar type of high-cost therapies available to patients at greatly reduced cost. And so investment in cell therapy here in Ireland could really lead to very significant societal as well as economic benefit.
Thank you.
So can I just ask, is there similar joined up thinking? Because we have somebody here from the research innovation in the Department of Health, that we have people from HPRA, from Enterprise Ireland, and of course the National Research Ethics. So just to see, how can we push this forward?
Thank you. So quick brief, if you don't mind, how are we keeping the same joined up approach? I mean, I think we talked about both, but maybe a comment on that. John, do you want to start?
Sure. No, I think maybe just very kind of briefly on this. Obviously, the whole idea, I suppose, around kind of the group that we have, the National Oversight Group, has been over the last 12 months, and it's had a particular focus because what we really wanted to do was get momentum in clinical trials kind of generally, so that we can move now to kind of actually to the next stage of implementing the recommendations and taking those next steps, which will be key. And I think within those kind of next steps, that's where we'll be able to kind of have a wider view across the landscape. But really what we wanted to do was kind of tackle kind of issues that were common across kind of different areas. And we did it with a particular focus, Donald and the group did. And I think that was kind of purposeful because we needed to focus the work of the group over that 12-month period, because that's what the minister wanted. But I think the next step is the critical piece, and that's where I think we can gain kind of momentum and actually kind of broaden out the work that can be done.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel for their really insightful for us. Excellent. We now have a very special presentation, and I'm wandering over here because I have to get the thing that is part of the special presentation. So I won't show it to you. I'll move it over here. So it's ready. Balance it. Perfect. Back in 2023, at the first Future Trials event, members of the Big C Choir, which is a cancer survivorship choir from Kildare, were inspired by the Future Trials vision, and they have been fundraising on behalf of trials in Galway and elsewhere. And they're here today, which is great, and they're here to make a donation. So here to receive their donation is clinical research nurse and trial coordinator Olive Ford on behalf of the HRB Clinical Research Facility in Galway. The donation is being used to purchase an ECG machine. We know that this is very relevant to cancer survivors, that they are at a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease, including heart failure and stroke. So we'd also like to welcome Christina O'Connell and Anne Lawler on the stage, representing the Big C Choir. We'll ask Olive to join us and Julie Stafford from Galway University Foundation to receive the donation. So Christina, Anne, Olive and Julie, would you mind joining me here on the stage? Thank you. You're all very welcome. So, Christina, you're joined today by other members of the Big C Choir in Galway. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming. Why was it so important to you all to fundraise for clinical trials?
Well, myself, I had breast cancer in 2009, and having went through my treatment and recovery, I decided to set up the choir to help to raise funds for children and both men and women for support groups and cancer care. And moving forward then to 2013, when I heard the interview with Brendan O'Connor and Professor Peter Dorn and the lovely lady Noreen Doyle, I just said, I wonder, could we do something to raise funds? So I have a relation of mine who's a fantastic little golfer. So I spoke to Hilda and I said, I wonder, could we bring golf and singing together? So we decided to have a golf classic. The weather was with us, thank God. We were praying for good weather. We had fantastic weather and we had a fantastic evening. And the ladies, we all sung that evening. And between then and now, we had raised 26,000. So I always like to split it, with between different groups. So yourselves will be receiving 10,000. James's Hospital will be receiving 10, and St. Vincent's in the cancer care will be receiving 6. And to date, we have raised, since 2012, setting up the choir, we've raised 140,000. So.
Olive, coming to you, this donation that you're about to receive has enabled the Clinical Research Facility to purchase that new ECG. How will it be used for clinical research?
Thank you, Christina. We're delighted in the Cancer Clinical Trials Unit to accept the donation. Firstly, it'll greatly enhance our capability to safely monitor and affect the side effects of treatment on patients. Going on the back of the great cardiology talks we had today, we know unfortunately one of the potential side effects of some chemotherapy, immunotherapy and targeted treatments can have cardiotoxic side effects. We've heard an awful lot about cost and effectiveness, so having a dedicated ECG machine to our department where we can identify changes and plan appropriately and in time will greatly enhance patient care. Listening to Siobhan talk earlier, when we learned about the Big C Choir, we saw it consisted about survivorship. And that's a big theme with a lot of our clinical trials now. People are living longer. So to be able to, for you to support us, to support our promise to deliver innovative, effective and safe treatments. And it's across a wide range of disease, both from early disease and late disease. So thank you very much. We'll truly appreciate it.
Thank you so much. So Christina, would you like to give the check to Olive now? I have it there for you. Thank you so much to the Big C Choir for joining us here today. Thank you. It's now time for lunch and more networking. Would you want to stay for some more photos? We might do a few more photos with you, so I'll ask you to stay. But for the rest of you, please go and enjoy the organic, locally sourced foods supported by Fáilte Ireland, and we'll see you back here at 2 p.m. for our final session. See you later.